Good morning. It's an honor to have you here at this year's conference, and we're going to be talking about the legislative session that ended earlier this year and had a lot of debates and a lot of big measures hung in the balance at the beginning of session and came out at the end of session in a way that I think is good for open government, and we're going to talk about a lot of those things. More specifically, the legislature approved measures to repair holes in the Texas Public Information Act that had been caused in the wake of certain Texas Supreme Court rulings, and also shore up the Open Meetings Act in the wake of a ruling from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The Texas Citizen Participation Act also found itself in the mix with the state's anti-SLAPP law, facing attempts to strip vital protections for speech and for speakers, and a broad coalition of stakeholders seeking to preserve those meaningful protections, as well as other issues as well. So we have a lot to cover, and I want to introduce our panel. We're honored to have our panelists here today. To my right, I'll start with my immediate right, Representative Todd Hunter, who represents constituents in Corpus Christi in District 32. He's serving in his 10th term in the Texas House of Representatives. During the 86th legislature, he was appointed to the State Affairs Committee and the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. And I have to give a shout out to SMU Law School and my fellow alum. In the Senate, we have Senator Kirk Watson, who like Representative Hunter, has authored and secured passage of several pieces of legislation to keep our government open and transparent. He was elected to the Texas Senate in 2006. He's our former mayor of our city here and has been reelected 4 times. He represents most of Travis County and the entirety of Bastrop County. And in 2018, his colleagues elected him to be President pro tem for the 86th legislature. He also served as vice chairman of the Senate's Nominations Committee and on committees overseeing education, finance, and higher education. And on the end, J.T. Morris, First Amendment attorney that also litigates speech defense cases in trial and appellate courts, and also handles matters involving intellectual property and digital media. During the 86th legislature, J.T. found himself in the thick of things in the effort to protect Texas's anti-SLAPP law. So I want to start with Senator Watson. In 2015, 2 state Supreme Court cases, Boeing Co. v. Paxton and Greater Houston Partnership v. Paxton, had profound impacts on the Texas Public Information Act. Senator Watson, can you set the stage for us and reflect on the legislature's response in the wake of those rulings?
Sure. Thank you. And as I reflect on that, the first thing I need to do is say thank you to the Freedom of Information Foundation, because keeping those issues at the forefront was a key part of the whole foundation of how we got through the legislative sessions, I guess is the way to approach that, as Chairman Hunter knows. So 2 cases. We refer to them generally as the Boeing case and the Greater Houston Partnership case. I'm not going to get into a detailed discussion of what they did, but they blew holes in the Public Information Act, primarily in the Boeing case, primarily because what they said is that the Supreme Court ruled that competitive or bidding exceptions were far broader, exceptions to the Public Information Act and turning over documents were far broader than what had been the interpretation, frankly, probably the plain language of the Act, but also the Attorney General's interpretations of those provisions for years. One of the things that it did is it said it allowed the private company to say that there was an exception to having to turn over the documents, when in the past, and the interpretations had always been that it was the governmental entity that would say that in an effort to protect the taxpayer or the public. So that made a big difference, and it created such a situation that basic contracting information was no longer being turned over, including, for example, the final contract. So if an entity entered into a contract with a governmental entity, a private entity entered in with a contract, they might be able to preclude the public being able to find out the terms of the final contract. The biggest example that we all talked about, of course, was the one in McAllen where Julio Iglesias sang at some festival, and that contract, they couldn't get that contract. Since I've said it at every speech I've ever given, I still maintain, and I've not heard from the city of McAllen, I will sing for half the price. That's all you have to do, is just offer me half the price. But the point is, who knows what it was? And that's ridiculous. The Greater Houston Partnership case was a case that involved instances where non-governmental entities, and I'll use the example of economic development groups, chambers of commerce, and as you see in the style of the case, the Greater Houston Partnership, entities that received governmental money and were performing governmental activities would take the position that they didn't need to turn over information because we're not the government. Obviously, you see the problem with that, and the problem is that you take governmental money, you take taxpayer money you would think you would know how it was spent, but the government gives it to a private entity and somehow that shields it. The law as written, the Public Information Act as written, said that you had to turn over the money if you spend or you are supported in whole or in part by public money. Somehow the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that you had to be sustained by public money, which meant that in most instances the people were able to argue that that's just not the case. The rest I would say, and I'll wrap up, is that we went into the legislative session with help on the House side by Chairman Hunter, State Representative Giovanni Capriglione, and others, and on the Senate side, I carried the legislation, but it was in the 85th session that we made our first effort to try to repair that after the rulings, and we didn't have success. In fact, it was a very disappointing session. There were changes between that session and the last session, including the hard work of a lot of people in this room of reaching out and to stakeholders and trying to do things differently, and I can talk more about that if anybody wants. But I'm proud to say that we came out of this last legislative session having passed legislation in Senate Bill 943 and 944 that made a change there, and I think is a positive change going forward.
I want to talk about last session and then compare it to this session, especially vis-a-vis, the legislative items that we just talked about in the wake of Boeing and Greater Houston Partnership, but also others. And Chairman Hunter, you've pressed for passage of numerous public access bills during your tenure, and you've worked on the issues that Senator Watson was talking about last session and saw them come into your chamber this past session. Can you share your thoughts on the overall transparency mood at the Capitol now, and maybe contrast it to what came out last session as well?
Open government historically reminds me of Three Dog Night. Not one is the loneliest number, but three is the loneliest number. I'm so glad to see that there's some other legislators that are being recognized, because the three I'm talking about are Senator Watson, myself, and Representative Gio Capriglione. Those three have band together when we got run over and then when we passed them. And so I'm glad to see that the support is expanding. So now, every time you hear that song, think about how we're expanding open government. Look, you all, here's the bottom line. I've been in the legislature. I would like to say I'm not old, I'm a ripe Cabernet. I have heard the sound bites in elections. I have been in the Capitol. I hear everybody tell me they're for local open government. Yet when time comes, where is everybody? It's a great sound bite, but you got to practice it. Senator Watson has been there with me the entire time, and Representative Capriglione has. And so I want you to know historically who has fought for you. Now, let's talk about the mood. You know, Texas, you'll get all these different views and analysts and all that. The real bottom line is squeaky wheel gets the grease in the Texas legislature. The longer we talk about open government, the longer we talk about transparency, it finally hits home. Now, you've got to help us. You know, one of my biggest push is sometimes the media is worried about covering that. Well, why? It's not just media. Open government is for the public, for the people. Just like the senator said, I get a kick that you use taxpayer money to pay for something, and we're all fiscal conservatives, and yet we then don't stand up and say, shouldn't we have access to the information? And why do we set up roller coaster speed bumps at your cost to get it? So what is the mood? The mood, because you have a different time, but it could change in 2 years, it could change in 4. Right now, you have attentiveness to open government and transparency. But there's a big underline under that. You need to help us push open government. You know, when I hear about all these other topics, nobody brings up open government. I don't want you to leave this conference saying, hey, the senator did great.
I want them leaving saying that.
Yes. But then next session, if they're quiet, then you and I have a harder time to do things. Let me address something real quick. We're lawyers. We do everything you're not supposed to be. It starts with an L, legislator and lawyer. We're not lobbyists currently. How about that? But I see the Attorney General representatives in the room. A lot of times you blame them because of the speed bump. They shouldn't be blamed. That's the law. They're interpreting the law, so they're unfortunately getting criticism. And it's not their fault. What should the mood of the legislature be? When we are pushing open government bills, it should be open to you. If there's some private lobby group sneaking around the back, which I believe there is on certain issues, it's kind of contradictory. We want open government, but we're going to sneak around your back, try to kill that particular bill. So bottom line, mood is good. And I think the senator and all your legislators need you plugged into the system. And don't ever give up. You go, when they see you, I always remember, out of sight, out of mind. Don't think that you did well and it's over. They could go back and reverse them. So whatever you do, it was a good session. It was a positive session. Mood is good, but then we got to crank up and do it again. And then I think we will go all the way around the bases and do something that I think is really good, which is getting access to information that is practical and common sense.
Can I highlight something?
Absolutely.
I want to highlight something that the chairman just said. So the 86th session is the one we just finished. The 85th session was a horrible session. We couldn't get bills out of committee in the House, not for lack of trying by people that we've identified, Chairman Hunter and Representative Capriglione. The Attorney General's office was great in helping us with stuff. We couldn't get bills out. It was horrible. I actually think that part of the reason the 86th was better is because the 85th was so horrible. And the chairman of the committee that was killing all that legislation didn't get reelected. So I think part of what happened in the 86th was a reaction to how bad it was in the 85th. I want to pause and say, but not everything in the 86th happened the way we would want. his really good bill that he has fought for over and over again to allow birth dates to be public record didn't pass. Another bill, and he mentions other members of the legislature, Speaker Pro Tem Moody from El Paso had legislation related to be able to get public records in death situations involving the police. That didn't make it, and we can talk more about that if others want to. But the point being, not everything we want to see happen happened. And here's my fear. This session was a good session in part because the previous one was so bad. But this was a good session. And what I'm worried about is everybody's going to think we've done it all, that we've completed everything, we're finished. And so when we come back next session, people are going to say, Hunter, I thought we had done this. Watson, I thought we were done with this. So we cannot let the success become a problem next session.
JT, in 2011, Chairman Hunter authored the anti-SLAPP law here in Texas, which provided some of the most meaningful protections against strategic lawsuits that are designed to stifle speech and speakers who engage on matters of public concern, some of the strongest protections in the United States. This session, that statute found itself in the midst of a very contentious debate, and maybe I'd like you to talk about what was at stake and what happened.
Sure, happy to be here. Thanks, Arif. I think going into the session, it was pretty clear that the anti-SLAPP law was going to come under attack and have some pretty big groups try to force through some amendments to really narrow its scope. Based in large part, the Texas Supreme Court has taken a pretty textualist approach to the statute and given it very broad meaning. It's probably a good thing. But you found lawyers sort of taking advantage of that, filing anti-SLAPP motions to dismiss in family law cases, purely private business disputes, and because the way the text was written, courts were granting motions to dismiss on those. So you had a number of special interest groups who didn't like that and wanted to really strip the anti-SLAPP law of its teeth. I think in early February, Texas for Lawsuits Reform came out with an editorial and also a brochure that they distributed to, I think, every lawmaker in the cabinet, sort of painting the TCPA, the Texas Citizens Participation Act, as this civil litigation boogeyman that was really clogging up the courts, was preventing good merit, claims with merit from proceeding through the court system and not letting litigants have their day in court. And the issue was, before the original bill dropped, that eventually became House Bill 2730, the media, public interest organizations, citizens, bloggers, people who would have a really important stake in these amendments to the anti-SLAPP bill, they were kept out of the process. And so the original bill, 2730 that came from Representative Leach, it really did not take a scalpel to the anti-SLAPP law. It basically attempted to reach in and pull out its guts. It would have been terrible if that bill had passed. It would have really prevented individual citizens, bloggers, independent journalists from using the law in most situations. It would have stripped the teeth from the fee shifting provision, because it would have allowed a plaintiff to sue, force a defendant to file an anti-SLAPP motion, spend 5 figures doing that, and then allow the plaintiff to walk away 3 days before the hearing and not have to pay the defendant's attorney's fees. So it would have created a really perverse incentive. So in reaction to that, Texas Freedom of Information Foundation, Laura Prather, a lot of and a couple other people really made a great effort to pull together a coalition of over 600 media organizations, public interest groups, public interest law firms like Arif's, social media platforms like Yelp, a really diverse array of people, but all who had a vested interest in preserving the core of the anti-SLAPP law, which was to ensure that Texans and people who are sued in Texas courts aren't dragged through the litigation process and having to defend themselves against meritless claims and lawsuits that are really attacking their right to free speech and the right to petition the government. So there was a lot of negotiations. You know, the stakeholder meetings were full of a lot of odd couples. You know, Texas Trial Lawyers Association was buddying up with TLR, which I don't know if that's ever happened in the history of the Texas legislative process. And you had some, but you know, so it was an interesting set of negotiations. I can answer questions about it as we go through, but really sort of the three main topics that were really debated over were matter of public concern, which a lot of the people pushing back against the law said was too broad. The other one was creating more exemptions to the law. You know, before there was a few really narrow exemptions for commercial speech, a couple of personal injury cases, that sort of thing. But you had a lot of groups at the table who all wanted their own exemption, whether it's the family code, non-disparagement clauses, landlord-tenant disputes. There was a lot of negotiation about that. And then really the biggest thing was the scope of the law itself and when it could be taken advantage of was another point of dispute. A lot of people wanted to narrow the law so it would only apply to speech actually made in public. So they wanted to take speech made in private, even though it related to a matter of public concern, out of the scope of the TCPA. For obvious reasons, you know, the Free Speech Coalition pushed back hard against that. There was a concern going into the committee hearing that that was actually going to be in the committee substitute, presented to the committee and open to public debate. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And you know, the committee hearing, I think we had over 40 witnesses show up, 4.5 hours. But you know, we had everybody from media organizations, independent journalists, Yelp's representative came, citizens who had been affected by the TCPA, and I think it really got the committee's attention. And ultimately what we came out, I think, of the session with was a bill that did in fact preserve the core of the TCPA. It still provides broad protection for speakers in Texas to have a way to dismiss meritless lawsuits that are attacking their expressive freedoms.
One of the things that was particularly striking, if I could ask you to follow up on this, is after weeks of churning with draft legislation and just basically getting all the exceptions baked into the draft, the folks that were asking for the exemptions were still very focused on changing the definition of matter of public concern. And you know, if you look back at the original bill and see who would be most drastically impacted, and the effort to continue narrowing matters of public concern, I mean, isn't there a link between those two things? Like, in other words, what kind of desire was it motivated by, and how was that overcome? Because the big battle in the committee was, what should we base our definition on? We have a great definition now, but there was an insistence on still changing it even with all the exceptions.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, there are probably multiple motivations for narrowing that. In the original bill, I think matter of public concern was actually proposed just to be deleted. So what you would have is the person filing the TCPA motion would have to show that they were engaging in constitutionally protected speech, which would have shifted the burden and sort of turned the TCPA on its head. Meaning, if you were sued for defamation, you would have to show what you said wasn't defamatory, which isn't the way the law should work. Really what the battle became is the breadth of the definition. What a lot of the people pushing back against the TCPA were upset with was they thought that it was too broad. You have this category of matters of public concern in the statute. I believe in 2011 that was actually lifted from Texas cases. So there wasn't that much of a basis to push back against it on, but they pushed back anyway. I think it again, Arif, came back to the fact that the people wanting to really narrow the scope of the statute wanted to take private speech, take speech that didn't occur in public out of the scope of the TCPA. We pushed back against that significantly. At the committee hearing, when we got the committee substitute, I think the night before, the morning before the hearing, they had tried to limit the matter of public concern to, I think, things that significantly are meaningful to the public. They put in language that would have, again, really narrowed the ability of people to use it. So we said, okay, why don't we use language from the United States Supreme Court, specifically the Snyder v. Phelps case, which was the Westboro Baptist Church, protesting with their, colorful language outside funerals, and said, why don't we just use the Supreme Court as a guide? That way, we have a flexible definition. Plaintiffs, judges, defendants, they can have more room to sort of maneuver around what matter of public concern means, but we're still allowing the TCPA to capture a broad range of speech, which is consistent with the First Amendment. The First Amendment sort of works on the premise that all speech is protected unless you can show it falls within one of the narrow exceptions defined by the Supreme Court. And sort of, I think, once we push the Supreme Court's definition from Snyder through, the opposition sort of backed off. We were able to preserve a very broad definition for matter of public concern.
Senator Watson, custodian loophole was an issue that both of you and Chairman Hunter worked on in the past session that carried over. But at the same time, you also worked on closing, I should frame this a little bit differently, restoring the walking quorum provision in the Texas Open Meetings Act, which also came in the wake of a court ruling. With those two things, in addition to Boeing and Greater Houston, you've already talked about those two. Can you address your efforts to close the custodian loophole and to address a walking quorum issue, which really came right before the session?
Yeah, I'll start with the custodian loophole. What that boils down to is the idea that a public official has a private laptop or a private computer at home, private cell phone, that kind of thing, but they're conducting public business on that private machine. I probably just showed my age. There's probably a better word for that, but I'll go with machine. Anyway, so we all pretty well, those of us that paid attention to this, thought it was pretty clear that if it's public business, it's still public, even though it might be on a private machine. If it's private, it's still private. That's what the law, I believe that was what the law really was from the very beginning. There was a case out of El Paso that indicated that the Public Information Act might not be as clear. There was a public official in El Paso said, I'm not turning it over. It's on my private equipment. It's not going to happen. The court indicated, well, it's not as clean as it ought to be, and there's no real mechanism for how the governmental entity gets that. So we clarified in this session, and I think made a really good clarification, that it's still public information, even though it might be on a private machine. Now I want to be real clear about this, because this is one of the things that we've gotten the weirdest response to, and I see the AG's office grinning, so apparently they too, maybe it's just us calling them, but I even had one local school district tell me that what we had passed in that law was now a teacher or an administrator can't send an email to the students or the parents on their iPhone. Well, no, that's not what it does. We just heard from somebody, there was apparently a conference held of a bunch of local government officials, and they're all panicked because of what they have to do. But here's what it boils down to, and I won't go into the details of how their panic is nuts, but it's still, if it's public, it's public. If it's private, it's private. Nothing about it says you can't, a school teacher can't send out a mass text or email to the students saying, here's what we're going to be doing and we need to do. But if it's public, it's going to be a public record. The law now says how you either need to store that, you need to either send it back to the governmental entity and let them store it if it's public information, or store it in such a way in compliance with the governmental entity's records retention program. And most governmental entities have a records retention program, and if they don't, they need to get one. But it's subject to that records retention program. It also creates a mechanism for how the custodian, we've got to go back to that word, the public official even after they're no longer a public official, are still the custodians of that information, and the governmental entity, if they need to get that from that custodian under the Public Information Act because of a request that's made, it creates a mechanism to do that. So what happened is, when the El Paso court ruled the way it did, it allowed us to clarify that. I think it's a good clarification, but obviously there are people that are still not understanding that. The second part of your question was, the walking quorum. So we get in the legislative session in January, and very quickly, I say very quickly, right before the filing deadline, right before the deadline for filing bills, the Court of Criminal Appeals, which is our highest court in Texas in criminal matters, ruled that the Open Meetings Act, not the Public Information Act, but the Open Meetings Act, was unconstitutionally vague because it wasn't clear how you deal with walking quorums. In other words, if one member talks to a second member of a governmental body, so if you've got 5 people on the commissioner's court, and let's say commissioner for precinct 1 talks to commissioner for precinct 2, then 3, 4, and works everything out, where it would have been a quorum of that body had they been in the room together having a public meeting, then that's illegal. So the court ruled it was unconstitutionally vague, and I won't go into all the details of that, but we were faced with a filing deadline, and so we worked very closely with the Attorney General's office, and my general counsel, Kelsey Erickson's here with us too, and we also worked with the chair of the committee on the House side that would go through, and along the lines of what the Chairman Hunter said, we had more people involved, and that was Chairman Dade Phelan, and we were able to put together a bill that I think now does a better job than probably what the open meetings law did before of explaining to local government officials how it is that they can have a deliberation. It has to be about a public matter, which has always been a worry of local government officials. Can we have a party where we're not talking about, we're just together talking about football? Or do we have to post that and that kind of thing? No, it has to be a public matter, and it has to be a deliberation in such a way where the member of the governmental body knows that there's going to be, knows that they're involved in communications that are going to be involving a number of people, so that if it were a meeting as allowed by the act, then it would be a quorum. So it clarifies that, and we had a lot of people give us input on that. Again, it is one that scares local governmental officials because they're worried that they'll somehow go astray if they talk to one person in a certain way. But I think it provides greater clarity, and I can answer specific questions if others have them.
Chairman Hunter, a date of birth is a small but important record. In 2015, which was a year for court rulings, the Third Court of Appeals in Paxson v. City of Dallas, expanding a Texas Supreme Court a holding, declared that all dates of birth covered under the Public Information Act were private. And since then, more than 10,000 Attorney General opinions have been issued foreclosing access information under the Paxson v. City of Dallas decision. Can you talk about your efforts to act as a check on the other branch in this area and address the date of birth issue and share with the audience some of your thoughts moving forward into next session vis-a-vis that issue specifically?
Now, what I want you to think about now, isn't it sound just really controversial about producing your date of birth? I mean, I want you to think about this. Boy, that just, woo. Why is it the only one we can't pass? I want you to think about that. Now, it's so difficult that while I was sitting here listening to the senator, I went on the internet, found out his birthday is March 18th, and Representative Capriglione's is March 8th. boy, that was difficult. Well, you're correct, they're elected officials. But I can also get on the internet and get non-elected officials. My point is, the House passed it this time. The Senate didn't. He was a helper. I will tell you, in the previous session, it was battled, just huge by the lobby. So I want you to think, why is that such an insurmountable task when information these days are very, very readily accessible? And I can't answer it. Don't know why. And the people that oppose it were never in my office. And that's going to be the challenge, I tell you. If you oppose something, show some respect and dignity to be there and say why. Don't sneak around the process and say, we'll stop it in the House, we'll stop it in the Senate. So all we're trying to do is clarify a court opinion that basically says you get a production of the date of birth. Let's say that the name Todd Hunter, Kirk Watson, there's 43 of us, and there is a report that needs to be placed in a newspaper or a broadcast. You want to make sure you have the right Kirk Watson or Todd Hunter if you are doing a criminal expose, a civil expose. So what you're really doing is dotting your I's, crossing your T's, making sure that reporting privilege is accurate. And you don't want to be saying, hey, this person did it, and it's the wrong person. And there are a lot of other examples. But yes, I've had a interesting hurdle. And we went from the first session, as you said, Senator, couldn't even get it out of committee anyplace. And then this last session, we get it out of committee, but we still then have a slowdown elsewhere. So the bottom line is, put your investigation hats on, and let's try to find out who really doesn't want it. It seems to me to be pretty common sense. But I do want to add one thing, since you talk about date of birth, and the senator talked about the issue of open records and freedom of information, public information requests. This isn't really in direct response to your question, but I want this group to think about it. I am a victim of Hurricane Harvey. Most people have forgotten us. My zone, they've forgotten. Just so you know, my district was the very first hit, and we were the very first forgotten. We now have another terrible weather event in the southeast Texas zone. The reason I bring this up is, let me give you a practical problem on open records. You take a small community that gets whacked by a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, all of a sudden private service providers start sending in open records requests. Well, some of our school districts can't even get the computers turned on. They can't gather the information. They can't find staff. And when they get it hooked up, they've got people sitting there 10, 12, 15 hours trying to gather information during a catastrophe. So I want to alert you that because of these weather events and the impact on certain governmental entities, there could be a look on how do you handle in a catastrophe, not from a media standpoint, but from private service providers who are trying to get information on contracting and bidding, and then you're overloading these smaller public entities. And I tell you that because the more I see weather events, this issue that was raised to me is going to be probably an issue that we've got to address in the upcoming session. And the other thing is, even though we're all lawyers up here, and we have an SMU connection. Remember, it's freedom of information and open records. It's not a private lawyer's discovery process. And so I want you to know we have kind of a couple of things going on that we need to look for in the future.
Before I open it up to questions, I wanted to toss to the panel a couple of issues involving transparency in the area of criminal justice. I think it was Chairman Hunter that mentioned a little bit earlier in our discussion that there were measures that are attempting to bring greater transparency to situations when people in custody die while in custody. And that was an issue. Another one that's been bubbling session after session involves transparency in the area of civil forfeiture. It's a great power that law enforcement has to take property on the mere suspicion that it's involved in a crime, even if someone's not arrested or convicted, and then suing that property to reap the proceeds, and which ends up in their own accounts, creating a perverse profit incentive. Could one of you address one or both of those and just get the sense of how do those transparency issues materialize in the area of criminal justice? Because it seems that the dynamic there makes it a more complex issue to work on as a lawmaker.
Yeah, and I'll try to do that. The public information that you could obtain when there's a death in custody. I think y'all have a panel right after this one that's going to be talking specifically about that. But I'll tell you part of what happened during the last legislature on this. Speaker Pro Tem Moody had a bill. He's also chair of criminal justice and was working that bill. There was a lot of effort put into killing that bill. And at the very end of the legislative session, he called great attention to this, and frankly, I think the attention that he's now called to it will be very helpful as we move forward to be able to make that information more public. At the very end of the session, he amended his bill onto Senate Bill 943, which is the maybe 944, I can't remember which one, 944 I'm being told, 944, which was the one that we haven't really talked about, but 944 had a variety of provisions in it that are better for open government and public information that kind of grew out of all of our stakeholders meetings on 943, the one that we were trying to fix, Boeing and the Greater Houston Partnership. He amended it on there. We were told almost immediately that if you do that, it will be vetoed. We spent a lot of time negotiating. Moody, me, and Gio Capriglione with the governor's office to try to figure out a way. Is there a way to do this and not end up losing all that we had all been doing on that bill? And ultimately, there really wasn't. And so the Speaker Pro Tem Moody, he withdrew his amendment. I think that has to be discussed. It has to be part of what we're looking at in next session. I'm still extremely irritated with those who were working to kill that bill, as I think a number of people are, and we're going to have to figure out how we address it. I will say that one of the messages that you ought to hear in this, as I listened to the description of what went on with the anti-SLAPP legislation, as I know what happened in other pieces of legislation, is taking the time for us to work with others and find out what concerns are and have these stakeholder efforts makes a difference in getting the legislation passed. It just does. It does for a couple of reasons. One is those of us that are for open government, we tend to become pretty strong in our belief about open government, and we just cannot see sometimes how somebody could have a different opinion. Well, Chairman Hunter just pointed out there are some circumstances that would call for a different approach to something. So the stakeholder process probably does well for those of us who are true believers. It also helps smoke out the vampires that are working in the darkness of the Capitol to kill things. I mean, I don't know why we would expect them to do anything different. They're fighting open government, so they're just doing, it's the old story of the toad and the scorpion, or the frog and the scorpion, where the scorpion says, will you give me a ride across this river? And the frog says, no, because you'll sting me and I'll die. And the scorpion says, well, why would I sting you? Because I'll drown. And he said, oh, well, that makes sense. So the scorpion crawls on his back and he swims across the river. About halfway across the river, the scorpion stings him. And now he's dying. He's poisoned and he's dying. And he looks up and he says, why'd you sting me? Now you're going to die. He says, it's in my nature. Well, that's what happens with some of these folks. But having stakeholder efforts with them helps smoke some of that out. Because that's an issue that's going to have to be addressed. We keep having examples of how it ought to be addressed. And unfortunately, this was not a good session on that one. And hopefully we can fix that next session.
On the asset forfeiture, sometimes the politics of the subject matter takes the attention. So you don't go to the open government, the open records, the transparency. So if it's a political issue, that's where the focus goes, and then it never gets to the core that we're talking about. The issue of asset forfeiture, I think the senator would agree, is still a political issue on which side you fall on the public policy side of that. And I think you're just going to have speed bumps until that is kind of unified on which way Texas wants to go.
And that's such a good point. That's also the case, I think, in dealing with public information related to deaths in police custody. That is still, as revealed by the concept of it would be vetoed if you added it to a Public Information Act bill. That's a very important point he just made.
Thank you for all these insights. I want to bring the audience into the discussion. We've got plenty of folks that are used to asking questions, and we'll take them in any order you want. So all you have to do is put your hand up, and I will call on folks one at a time. Oh, I know you've got some questions. Ken has great questions sometimes. So all the way in the back.
You were talking about the various stakeholders involved. I guess how the process went forward. I guess we're true believers, and we need to understand how others think about some of these issues. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics. I guess I'm trying to draw out. There's a power dynamic also. In addition to what's right, what's wrong, there's a certain power dynamic. And in terms of the Boeing fix, the so-called GHG fix, I think we can all agree in this room that we wound up with something that's nowhere near as good as what we had before Boeing. We didn't really fix Boeing at all. But part of that isn't it the case that our opponents were simply too strong, in too strong a position to persuade rationally, and they just had a strong position that simply could not reach. And is that going to be the case going forward too in the further session?
Well, so historically, the Public Information Act really came into being after an enormous scandal, the Sharpstown scandal. And the language of the Public Information Act is very pure and very good. You are right when you suggest or say, make the statement that there's a power differential. And in many instances, that does make a big difference in what you're able to achieve. As you know, session before last, we simply tried to plug the hole blown into the Public Information Act by the court, which I could make the argument that the court was following politics. the power differential that you talk about. Particularly when we all read what they did in the plain language and in Attorney General opinions regarding and determinations regarding the Public Information Act over the years. I could make an argument that that was a almost political decision, if not an entirely political decision, based upon the power differential. Maybe it's that we have to work in that place every day where you see the power differentials. But while you're critical of the fix, well, you won't even call it a fix. You kind of think we wasted our time or spun around. But while you're critical of the change and the difference, it was an important change, and we could have been as pure as you want to be. And we would be maybe not even having this panel discussion, but if I were here, I'd be telling you how we failed from the session before. So I guess part of what I say is that what you call a power differential, I agree with, but it is also the practical reality of being in that building and having to pass something.
Don't get me wrong. What we have now is certainly better than what we had before we passed this bill. No question. And it remains to be seen exactly how it's going to be construed by the Attorney General. So I'm not, I don't want to stop that, but I do want to kind of get a sense for how would we deal with this going forward also. Is this a permanent state? Is public information going to constantly have to take a second seat to business interests, principally when we talk about Boeing-related issues or PhD-related issues? Is this at one time, open government was more ascendant. It was more ascendant in the 90s. It was more ascendant in the 80s and 70s. Its star has fallen a lot, and the power differential has changed considerably. Is that a permanent state? Is that what we're going to be living with?
I think it is certainly the current state, and as long as elected officials make these decisions. When you weren't here yet when Chairman Hunter talked about he's always felt like a three-dog night, and there are only three of us in that building working for some of this stuff. That's growing. I think elections do matter. And I think that the people in this room and those who are true believers, and I don't say that with a negative connotation, but those that are true believers are working to make sure we elect people that are willing to take on the power differential. That's where you make the change. It's not just us talking to each other. You and I are probably going to agree about 80% of the time. At least in my experience, we probably will. The point being, that's not where the difference will get made. That power differential that currently exists it's a strong power differential. It's absolutely strong. I mean, when part of the bill that fixes Greater Houston Partnership says that as long as you don't get $1 million or more from the government, then you're not going to be subject to the Public Information Act. Well, that's as arbitrary as hell. And I'll admit that's as arbitrary as hell. But let me tell you, that's better than where we started. And that's by definition a power differential. But we got elections matter. And in this state, right now, the business interest overpower some of what we would like to see otherwise.
Let me add something. Since you brought up the 70s, 80s, and 90s, seems like we've got a new music tour. I was there in the early 90s when he was just a mere lawyer. That should give you history. I'm going to give you a different spin. I'm going to challenge everybody in this room. I've been there since 1989. I've done everything you're not supposed to do. 1989 to 1997, I was a Democrat. I voluntarily left. I wasn't being put in jail. I actually voluntarily left. I left for 11 years. I came back, and then I've served continuously as a Republican. I'm all over the place, and I'm glad I have been. I actually even lobbied in between. That's why I said I've done everything wrong, but I've seen everything. So this is what I challenge you on. You are correct, but let me give you a different view. I don't think open government has lost its shine. I think I came in when they put computers on the desks. One of the reasons I left was I had to listen to my son and daughter's baseball, softball games through a cell phone, through a landline. And I learned you can always run for office, but you can't be at home. But what I have seen is this. If you don't make it matter, you give an excuse to never address it. For example, this is great, Freedom of Information's doing this, but why aren't every one of you having these sort of conferences in your areas? Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Public officials need to see you. It's easier to tell you yes when they see you. And the senator's right, elections do matter. Call everybody out on open government. But you matter. And there are a lot of people that won't have opponents. I want you to challenge everybody because every session is a different group, different theme, different approach. But if it's a constant issue, because I talk with the group, I've been trying to fire up the groups through the last few years because I give the success this session that you all pushed the buttons for over these years. So really, it does matter that they see you, they hear from you, and they feel it's an important issue.
Right here in the front. Right, yes?
My understanding, and I could be wrong, is that the bill left out redistricting. And I wanted to see why that was the case and the impact that it's going to have going forward.
Here's the way I would approach redistricting was not really a focus of the bill. You have 943, which is in essence a contracting bill, and then you have 944, which is what I would call a cleanup type of bill that has a number of different things in it about how, including custodial and that. You have a lot of stuff in that, and then you have the open meetings bill would be the three that I was most involved with. But you raise a very important point. And in fact, I'm going to have a few words to say today at lunch, and one of the things I'm going to mention is the role that everybody ought to be playing in making sure that we have a very open redistricting process. And here's my fear. Something we haven't talked about, and I don't know why we haven't, it's just by accident, but at the very end of the session, if you want to talk about what we ought to be fearful of, at the very end of the session, there was a bill passed with very little discussion, very little debate, and very little knowledge of what was in the bill. And it basically increases the amount of legislative privilege, if you will, on communications that can occur between the parliamentarian and of the bodies and the members, between the members and their staff and other staff. And I believe it was probably expressly done because of redistricting. Because a lot of what happened in the litigation arising out of previous redistricting, a lot of the information, the public information obtained that challenged those decisions came out of the very things that now may be shielded. Like in the Senate, I and three other members were all that voted against it. It's a bad, in my opinion, it's a bad piece of legislation that creates less open government not so much because of the power differential, but because of the politics, as Chairman Hunter has indicated, the politics that get played. We don't have to do that. I mean, it may be legislation, but you all need to be calling. I can't imagine anything we're going to do in the next legislative session that ought to be more open than how people are going to be allowed to vote and who they're going to get to vote for and how those lines are going to be drawn. But I do believe there was an effort to close that off, and we're all going to have to demand the openness that's important. And I think that's probably what you're referring to.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other hands up? Well, JT, let me ask you something. Chairman Hunter referenced the impact that media representatives can have on the legislative process, and also the squeaky wheels that can draw the attention that's necessary, or that creates a set of the set of circumstances that's necessary to get across the finish line. So with the anti-SLAPP bill, you had all sorts of folks, transparency orgs, First Amendment groups, right to life groups, criminal justice groups, all fully engaged. And can you speak to just like what those squeaky wheels, how that actually has a practical effect on the legislative process within a bill that has a lot of stakeholders and a lot of interest?
Yeah, in terms of at least the anti-SLAPP negotiations and ultimately what came out, I think that was critical to really pushing back against some of the proposals that would have gutted the anti-SLAPP law. Having media representatives there, whether from big media, independent journalists, like Ken up here, I think he testified and did a great job, citizens, bloggers, those were the people that sort of opened up the eyes, I think, of Representative Leach, Speaker Pro Tem Moody, kind of like what Senator Watson was saying. When you have those stakeholder negotiations, sometimes people get so engrossed in one side of things that it takes somebody on the other side of the aisle to really open their eyes. One great example we had during the negotiations, I had mentioned earlier, the initial bill had this provision where a plaintiff could sue and then walk away 3 days before the hearing, and the defendant wouldn't get their fees back associated with filing the anti-SLAPP motion. We had a citizen come in, explain to the representatives and senators that were there about how she got sued for defamation over a review she left on Google and other places online, and that without the anti-SLAPP fee shifting provision, she would have had to engage in self-censorship. And the minute after she stopped telling her story, Representative Leach said, okay, we're getting rid of that provision in the bill. So those real, the sort of realistic and personal stories that are reiterated over and over and over again, I think are critical to when we're talking about getting bills passed that still protect free speech, expanding the scope of open government. I think it's really important. I think, at least in the anti-SLAPP procedure that we went through this past session, the squeaky wheel of the media, of citizens, of public interest groups, all of which have been positively affected by having a broad anti-SLAPP bill, was critical in making sure that the core of the bill was protected and that Texans still enjoy broad free speech rights.
Chairman Hunter, Senator Watson, JT Morris, thanks for bringing all your efforts and experience to bear this legislative session and really to push and advance the cause of open government and transparency forward. Please join me in thanking our panel.